If you are watching this, then the containment has failed. If you are watching this, it means I am likely dead, or currently being transported to a black site that doesn't exist on any map. My name is Silas. For the last 30 years, I have lived as a ghost on the edge of the Olympic Peninsula. I came out here to forget, to let the moss and the rain wash away the things I did overseas. I served 3 tours. I was a tracker, a specialist. I spent my youth hunting men in jungles where the sun never touched the ground. I thought I had seen every kind of evil this world had to offer. I thought I knew what a monster looked like. I was wrong, because the true monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows of the old growth forest. They aren't the creatures we tell our children about to keep them in bed at night. The real monsters wear suits. They drive black SUVs with tinted windows. They have badges that give them the authority to erase a human life as easily as you wipe dust from a table. I am recording this testimony because the world needs to know what is buried beneath Ridge 44. They call it a myth, a legend, a hoax for tourists. But I have touched it. I have smelled its blood. I have looked into eyes that held a wisdom older than our entire civilization. Visual, a quick blurry montage, a massive footprint in mud, a blurred shape moving through trees, a government helicopter hovering low over treetops. Narrator. They want you to believe we are alone in these woods. They want you to believe that humanity is the apex predator. That is the lie they sell to keep the panic down. But I broke the rules. I didn't just see something I shouldn't have. I intervened. It's funny. When I first moved to this cabin, all I wanted was silence. I wanted the ringing in my ears to stop, the explosions, the screaming. I built a perimeter. I set my traps. I lived off the grid, eating what I killed, drinking from the creek. I became part of the landscape. I thought I was the only thing watching these woods, but for years, something was watching me back, something curious, something gentle. And when the government came, when the containment units arrived with their thermal scopes and their capture poles, I had to make a choice between my country and my conscience, a choice between the law and what was right. I'm going to tell you the whole story now. From the blood in the snow to the final standoff. I don't know how much time I have left. I can hear the rotors of the choppers in the valley below. They are sweeping the grid. They are getting closer. So listen carefully. This isn't a campfire story. This is a confession. It started on a Tuesday in late November. The kind of morning that chills you down to the marrow no matter how many layers of wool you're wearing. The mist was clinging to the valley floor, thick as cotton. You couldn't see 10 feet in front of your face. I was up before dawn, as always. Old habits from the service don't die. They just change zip codes. I brewed my coffee, black, bitter as hell, and stepped out onto the porch. Usually the woods are waking up at that hour. You hear the chatter of the Stellar's jays, the rustle of squirrels, the distant crack of elk moving through the brush. It's a symphony of life. But that morning, silence. Not the peaceful silence of a library. This was a predatory silence, the kind of heavy, suffocating stillness that happens when an apex predator is near. The birds knew. The deer knew. Everything was holding its breath. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That sixth sense that saved my life a dozen times in the war was screaming at me. Something was wrong on my land. I grabbed my rifle, a vintage Remington 700 that I've kept oiled and zeroed for 20 years, and stepped off the porch. I didn't take the trail. I moved through the brush, stepping heel to toe to muffle my sound, scanning the tree line. The air smelled strange. Usually it smells of pine needles and damp earth, but today, there was an undercurrent of something metallic, copper, and something else, a heavy, musky scent, wet fur, but stronger than a bear, more pungent than an elk in rut. I tracked the scent for a quarter mile down towards the creek bed where the water line had risen from the recent rains. The terrain here is treacherous. Slick rocks, hidden roots, tangles of devil's club that can tear through denim. I moved slow. The smell was getting stronger, burning my nostrils. Then, I saw the blood. It wasn't a few drops. It was a massacre. A trail of bright crimson arterial spray painted across the gray stones of the creek bank. Whatever lost this blood was big, and it was dying. My mind immediately went to poachers. We get them up here sometimes. Idiots from the city trying to bag a trophy bear out of season. I flicked the safety off on my rifle, anger rising in my chest. If someone had wounded an animal and left it to suffer, I was going to have a serious conversation with them. I followed the trail around a bend in the creek where an ancient cedar had fallen, creating a natural shelter. The blood stopped there. I approached slowly, rifle raised, eye to the scope. I expected to find a wounded black bear, maybe a cougar. What I saw defied every law of biology I had ever learned. It was slumped against the dead cedar, heaving for air. At first, my brain refused to process the image. It tried to categorize it as a bear standing on its hind legs. But the proportions were all wrong. The legs were too long, too muscular. The shoulders were massive, wider than a doorframe. It was covered in dark, matted hair that blended perfectly with the shadows of the forest floor. It heard me. The creature turned its head, and that was the moment my world fractured. It didn't have the snout of a bear. It had a face. A flat, wide, dark face with skin like weathered leather. A heavy brow ridge shaded its eyes, but I could see them clearly. They were dark brown, almost black, and they were terrified. This wasn't an animal reacting on instinct. This was a being processing its own mortality. It tried to push itself up, letting out a low, guttural whimper that sounded disturbingly human. I saw the wound then, a jagged, ugly tear in its side just below the ribs. It looked like it had been hit by high-caliber round, maybe a 50 cal, or torn by something mechanical. The flesh was shredded. It was losing blood fast. I stood there frozen. My finger hovered over the trigger. My training dictated that I should neutralize the unknown threat. But looking at this creature, this giant, 8-foot-tall being that was clutching its side and looking at me with pleading eyes, I couldn't do it. It raised a hand towards me, a hand with 5 fingers and an opposable thumb. The palm was black and leathery, the size of a catcher's mitt. It wasn't a threat. It was a gesture of surrender. I lowered the rifle. I took a step forward, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Easy," I whispered, my voice raspy from disuse. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The creature let out a long exhale, its massive chest shuddering, and slumped back against the log. It had decided to trust me, and in that moment I became an accomplice to the biggest secret in history. There is a specific protocol for finding a wounded hostile in the field. You secure the weapon, you secure the area, and you call for extraction or disposal. It's binary, it's clean. But standing there in the shadow of that ancient cedar with the smell of copper and wet pine filling my lungs, the protocol disintegrated. The creature, I couldn't call it an it anymore, not after seeing those eyes, was losing consciousness. The massive chest, broad as a rain barrel, was rising and falling in shallow, ragged hitches. The blood was dark and thick, pooling in the moss at an alarming rate. I knew I had about 3 minutes before he went into shock, maybe less. I slung my rifle across my back, the cold steel against my spine reminding me of the violence that likely put him in this state. I took another step closer. He flinched, a low rumble vibrating deep in his throat. It wasn't a growl. It was a sound of pain, like a tectonic plate shifting deep underground. "I'm going to help you," I said, keeping my voice flat and steady. "But you have to let me touch you." I don't know if he understood the English language, or if he just read the intent in my posture, but his muscles relaxed slightly. He laid his massive head back against the rotting wood of the fallen tree. I knelt beside him. The heat radiating off his body was immense. It was like sitting next to a furnace. I reached out and touched his side, near the wound. His fur was coarse like wire wool, but oily and thick near the skin, nature's perfect waterproofing. I parted the matted hair to see the damage. My stomach turned. I've seen shrapnel wounds. I've seen what landmines do to a Humvee, and I've stitched up boys who were torn apart by jungle traps. But this was surgical. There was a clean entry wound, small and precise, and a jagged, ugly exit wound where the round had tumbled. This wasn't a stray bullet from a deer hunter's .36. This was military-grade hardware, probably a 7.62mm or something specialized for penetration. Someone had taken a shot at this thing with the intent to kill, not to maim, and they had missed the heart by inches. "You're a lucky son of a bitch," I muttered, pulling the med kit from my belt. It was a small trauma pack I always carried, force of habit, a tourniquet, some clotting gauze, and a pressure bandage. It wasn't enough for a creature this size, but it had to work. I pressed the clotting gauze into the wound. He roared, a sound so loud it seemed to silence the entire forest instantly, and his arm shot out. His hand clamped onto my shoulder. I froze. With one squeeze, he could have shattered my clavicle like a dry twig. His grip was iron. I looked him in the eye, trying not to broadcast fear. "I know," I said through gritted teeth. "I know it hurts. But if I don't stop the bleeding, you die right here in the mud." He held my gaze for a second that felt like an hour. Then slowly he released me. He understood. That intelligence, it was terrifying. It forced me to acknowledge that I wasn't dealing with an animal. I was dealing with a person. A person from a different species, maybe, but a person nonetheless. I worked fast. I packed the wound, applying pressure until my arms shook. The blood flow slowed to a trickle. I wrapped the pressure bandage around his torso. It was barely long enough, so I had to improvise, using my own belt to secure it. But we weren't safe yet. We were in the open, down by the creek. If the people who shot him were tracking the blood trail, and if they were half as good as I used to be, they certainly were, they would be here within the hour. "We have to move," I told him. Getting him up was a nightmare of physics. He must have weighed 600 pounds, maybe more. Solid muscle and bone. I wedged my shoulder under his arm. His arm was as thick as my thigh and heaved. He groaned and pushed with his legs. Together we stumbled up the bank. Every step was a struggle. My bad knee, the souvenir from my second tour, was screaming in protest. We moved like a pair of drunks lurching through the underbrush. I guided him away from the game trails, sticking to the rocky patches where we wouldn't leave footprints. My cabin was a quarter-mile uphill. It felt like 10 miles. I could hear his breathing getting wetter, a sign of fluid in the lungs. He was fading. "Stay with me, big guy," I grunted, sweat stinging my eyes. Almost there. I couldn't take him into the cabin. If they came searching, the house was the first place they'd toss. I steered us toward the old woodshed out back. It was built into the side of the hill, half buried, with a dirt floor and thick timber walls. It was cool, dark, and defensible. We made it to the door. I kicked it open and we collapsed inside onto a pile of old canvas tarps. He went down hard, his breathing ragged. I checked the bandage. It had held mostly. I didn't have time to rest. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by the cold logic of survival. I had a wounded giant in my shed, but I had left a roadmap leading right to us. I grabbed a bucket and a stiff-bristled broom from the corner. "Don't make a sound," I whispered to him. He blinked slowly, his eyes half closed. I ran back down to the creek. For the next 45 minutes I scrubbed. I washed the blood off the rocks. I kicked dirt over the scuffle marks. I used a branch to fluff up the matted grass where we had walked. I backtracked 100 yards in the opposite direction and laid a false trail, snapping twigs and disturbing the moss, leading away from my property and towards the treacherous cliffs to the north. By the time I got back to the cabin, my hands were numb from the freezing water and my heart was pounding a hole in my chest. I sat on my porch, rifle across my lap, and waited. I knew they were coming. You don't fire a high-velocity round in these woods without someone coming to check the kill. I had made my decision. I had chosen a side. I just hoped I hadn't just signed my own death warrant. I didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes after I washed the last trace of blood from my hands, the convoy appeared. It wasn't the local sheriff. I know Sheriff Miller. He drives a rusted Bronco and stops by occasionally to check if I'm still breathing. This was a procession of funeral black SUVs, shiny and out of place against the backdrop of towering pines and mud. They moved with a synchronized aggression, tires crunching over the gravel of my driveway like grinding teeth. I sat on the porch, my rocking chair creaking rhythmically. I made a point of cleaning my rifle. It's a psychological tactic. Show them you're armed, but occupied. Make them interrupt you. 3 doors opened in unison. 4 men stepped out. They didn't look like hikers, and they certainly didn't look like park rangers. They wore tactical windbreakers with no insignias, cargo pants, and boots that cost more than my truck. They moved with that specific arrogance of men who are used to having clearance everywhere they go. The leader approached the steps. He was young, clean-shaven, with eyes dead as a shark's. He smelled of antiseptic soap and city smog, a chemical stink that assaulted my nose after years of breathing nothing but clean mountain air. "Morning," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a demand for attention. "Private property," I replied, not looking up from the bolt of my Remington. "Signs on the gate, you missed it?" "We're conducting a survey of the area," the man said, ignoring my comment. He flashed a badge too quickly for me to read, but I saw the Federal Eagle. There were reports of illegal poaching activity in this sector. High-caliber gunfire heard. You hear anything like that, sir? My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my hands steady. This is what we called psyops back in the day. They lie to you to gauge your reaction. I heard a shot, I lied, looking him dead in the eye. Sounded like a truck backfiring down in the valley. Echoes play tricks out here. The agent smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. A truck, right. And you haven't seen any injured wildlife? Large bears? Maybe something that looked like a bear but moved differently? The specificity of the question sent a chill down my spine. They knew. They knew exactly what they had hit. I haven't seen anything but squirrels in my own reflection, I spat, reassembling the rifle with a loud metallic clack. Now, unless you have a warrant, you're trespassing. The agent stared at me. For a long, silent minute, we were just two predators sizing each other up. He was looking for a crack in my armor, a twitch, a bead of sweat. I gave him nothing but the 1,000-yard stare I earned in the rice paddies of 71. Check the perimeter, he ordered his men, not breaking eye contact with me. You step 1 foot in my cabin and I call the sheriff, I warned, standing up. Just the perimeter, sir. Standard procedure. I had to watch helpless as they walked around my property. They moved in a grid pattern, professional, thorough. I watched one of them kneel near the woodpile, scanning the ground with a handheld device, thermal maybe, or a Geiger counter. I thanked God I had spent that hour scrubbing the creek bed. Then one of them turned towards the woodshed. My blood ran cold. The creature was in there, bleeding, scared. If he made a sound, a whimper, a shift of weight, it was over. I calculated the distance. I had 5 rounds in the magazine. There were 4 of them. I could drop the leader and the one near the shed before they cleared their holsters. But then what? A shootout with the federal government? I'd be dead before sunset. The agent walked up to the shed door. He reached for the handle. I gripped the porch railing so hard I felt the wood splinter under my fingernails. That's where I keep my generator, I shouted, my voice cracking just slightly. Gas fumes are bad in there. Don't light a match. The agent paused. He looked at the door, then back at me. He sniffed the air. The shed was old. It smelled of gasoline and rot naturally. It masked the scent of the creature. Hopefully. He tapped the door with his knuckles. Thud, thud. Silence from inside. Absolute, deathly silence. The agent shrugged and turned away. Clear, he called out. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My knees felt like water. The leader turned back to me. We'll be in the area for a few days, setting up a containment zone for the poachers. If you see anything unusual, anything at all, you call this number. He handed me a card. It was blank, except for a 10-digit number. No agency name. No logo. Don't go wandering in the woods, sir, he added, his voice dropping an octave. A veiled threat. It's dangerous season. They piled back into the SUVs and reversed out. I watched them until the dust settled and the sound of their engines faded into the wind. I didn't move for 10 minutes. I couldn't risk them leaving a drone behind or a man in the trees watching with a scope. I went inside the cabin, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and drank it in one swallow. Then I went out the back door, crawling through the tall grass to the shed, staying below the window line. I slipped inside the dark timber room. It was pitch black save for the sliver of light coming through the cracks. They're gone, I whispered. A massive shape shifted in the corner. 2 amber eyes reflected the tiny amount of light. He was awake. He was holding the bandage against his side. He looked at me, and then he did something that broke me. He pushed a small, smooth stone towards me across the dirt floor. I picked it up. It was a river rock, perfectly round. A gift? A peace offering? Or maybe just an acknowledgement that we were now in this foxhole together. Yeah, I said, my voice trembling as the reality of what I had just done crashed down on me. We fooled them, but they aren't gone. They're just regrouping. I sat there in the dark with a mythical monster, listening to the wind howl outside, realizing that my quiet life was over. I wasn't a retired veteran anymore. I was the insurgent, and I had just declared war on the United States government. I kept that stone. It's sitting on my desk right now. If you think I did the right thing by lying to them, hit the like button. If you think I was a fool, leave a comment. I need to know if I'm the only one who sees the humanity in him. They say adrenaline is a hell of a drug, but it wears off. And when it does, you're left with the cold, hard logistics of reality. The agents didn't come back the next day. or the day after. But they didn't leave either. I could feel them. It's what we called theater presence in the service. I'd see a drone buzzing high above the tree line, just a speck of gray against the white clouds, hovering for hours. I'd hear the static on my landline phone, the telltale click of a recording device kicking in whenever I picked up the receiver. I stopped going into town. I stopped answering the phone. I severed every tie I had with the outside world. That was the first sacrifice. To keep him safe, I had to become invisible. But invisibility requires resources. Do you have any idea how many calories an 8-foot, 600-pound hominid needs just to maintain body heat in a freezing winter? The biology books don't cover that. I emptied my savings account. I made midnight runs to a wholesale store 3 towns over, buying 50-pound bags of rice, dried beans, and oats. I bought peanut butter by the crate. I looked like a doomsday prepper losing his mind. The cashier looked at me with pity, thinking the old veteran had finally snapped. Maybe I had. But rice wasn't enough. He needed protein. I became a poacher on my own land. I hunted deer, not for sport, but for survival. I dressed the meat in the bathtub to avoid leaving scent trails outside. The cabin began to smell of raw meat and wood smoke, a primal, cave-like atmosphere. It got too cold for the shed. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero. I couldn't leave him out there to freeze while he was still healing. So, I brought him inside. Moving him into the cabin was the biggest risk I had taken yet. If they breached the door, there was no explanation. No gas generator excuse. Just me and a monster in the living room. He took up half the space. He sat on the rug by the wood stove, his massive knees pulled to his chest. He was fascinating to watch. He had a dexterity that was shocking. I watched him peel a mandarin orange with those giant leather-clad fingers, keeping the peel in one perfect spiral. He was gentle, careful. We fell into a routine, a silent domesticity born of necessity. I would change his bandages. He would watch me with those deep amber eyes. The wound was healing, but the scar tissue was thick and ropey. His regenerative abilities were off the charts. What would have taken a human 6 months to heal, he managed in 3 weeks. But the isolation was eating me alive. I couldn't sleep. Every snap of a twig outside sounded like a tactical boot. I spent my nights patrolling the windows, rifle in hand, watching the snow fall. I was losing weight. My eyes were sunken. The stress was triggering my old tremors. One night, the paranoia broke me. It was 3 a.m. A storm was raging outside. I was sitting in the armchair staring at the door, convinced that tonight was the night the hit squad would come. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my coffee mug. The ghosts of my past, the war, the friends I lost, started mixing with the fear of the present. I started to weep. Silent, ugly tears of exhaustion. I felt a shift in the room. The creature, I had started calling him the guest in my head, moved from the fire. He approached me silently. He loomed over my chair, a mountain of shadow. He reached out. I flinched, expecting violence. But he simply placed that massive hand on my trembling shoulder. The heat from his palm soaked through my flannel shirt. It was heavy, grounding. He made a low humming sound in his chest, a vibration that I could feel in my own bones. It wasn't a growl. It was a lullaby. He stayed there until my shaking stopped. That was the moment I realized the truth. I wasn't just saving him. In some twisted way, he was saving me. For 10 years, I had been alone in this cabin, waiting to die, letting my trauma consume me. Now, I had a mission. I had a purpose. I looked up at him. "We're in deep trouble, buddy," I whispered. He blinked, slowly, and withdrew his hand. He went to the window, peering out through the crack in the curtains. He growled low, a warning. I joined him. Far down the valley on the access road that leads to the highway, I saw lights, not car headlights. These were floodlights, powerful industrial beams cutting through the snowstorm. They were setting up a perimeter, a siege line. They weren't just watching anymore. They were preparing to move in. I realized then that my supply runs, my secrecy, my sacrifice, it had bought us time, but it hadn't bought us safety. The noose was tightening. I looked at the guest. He was fully healed now. He was strong, and he was restless. "We can't stay here," I said to the reflection in the glass. "If we stay here, we die." I turned to my map on the wall. The Olympic Mountains are vast, rugged, and unforgiving. Millions of acres of wilderness where no man goes. But to get there, we had to cross the highway. We had to cross the containment line. I looked at my rifle, then at the few boxes of ammo I had left. I looked at the creature who had trusted me with his life. I had sacrificed my peace. I had sacrificed my safety. Now I was going to have to sacrifice my home. "Pack your bags," I said, a grim smile touching my lips for the first time in weeks. "We're going for a walk." We left at 200 hours, the witching hour. The snow was falling so hard it was erasing the world as it happened. Perfect cover for a ghost. I left my truck. I left the photos of my wife on the mantel. I left the only home I had known for a decade. I walked out the back door with a rucksack, my rifle, and a creature the government would burn the forest down to catch. The plan was madness. We had to thread the needle between 2 checkpoints on the logging road, then push north into the dead zone, a stretch of wilderness so rugged that even the topographic maps have blank spots. For the first mile, I led. I moved us through the drainage ditches, staying low. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. My breath plumed in front of me, freezing in my beard. But as we hit the tree line of the deep woods, the dynamic shifted. The guest stopped. He grabbed the back of my parka and pulled me down into the snow. I opened my mouth to protest, but he pressed a massive finger to his lips. 10 seconds later, I heard it, the low electric whine of a drone. It passed directly overhead, its thermal camera sweeping the ground. If we had been standing, we would have been 2 glowing heat signatures on a screen in a command tent. Buried in the snow, under the canopy, we were invisible. He had heard it before I even knew it existed. His senses weren't just sharp, they were tuned to a frequency I couldn't comprehend. From that moment on, he led. He moved through the forest like smoke. Despite his size, he didn't break twigs. He placed his massive feet with a deliberate precision, rolling his weight so that he made no sound. I struggled to keep up. I'm an old man with bad knees and lungs scarred by cheap cigarettes and burn pits. He was an apex organism in his prime. We climbed for hours. The terrain turned vertical. Slick rock faces covered in black ice. Thickets of devil's club that tore at my gear. The blizzard worsened, turning into a whiteout. The wind screamed through the canyons like a banshee. I started to fail. My legs were burning. My core temperature was dropping. I stumbled over a hidden root and went down hard, twisting my bad knee. I tried to stand, but the pain was blinding. I collapsed back into the snow, gasping, the black edges of hypothermia starting to creep into my vision. "Go," I wheezed, waving my hand at him. "Leave me, they'll catch us both." He stopped. He turned back, his silhouette towering against the swirling white. He looked at me, head cocked to the side. He didn't leave. He came back. He scooped me up. I'm a 200-pound man with 50 pounds of gear. He lifted me like I was a child's doll. He placed me on his back, his arms locking my legs in place. I grabbed handfuls of his thick, oily fur to hold on. The heat coming off him was incredible. It wasn't just body heat. It was like being strapped to a nuclear reactor. It soaked into my freezing limbs, driving the cold away. And then, he ran. I have ridden in Humvees, helicopters, and speedboats. I have never experienced power like that. He bounded up the mountain, taking 10-foot strides, effortless power driving us up slopes I would have needed ropes to climb. As we moved, he started to make a sound, a low, rhythmic humming deep in his chest. It vibrated through my own chest cavity. It wasn't just a sound, it was communication. It was calming. It stabilized my heart rate. It made me feel safe, safer than I had ever felt inside a tank. We crested the ridge just as the sun began to bleed a gray light over the horizon. We were miles away from the cabin now, deep in the sanctuary of the high country. He found a small cave, a fissure in the rock face protected by an overhang. He set me down gently. My knee was throbbing, but I was alive. He sat opposite me, watching the entrance. He picked up a handful of snow and ate it. Then he looked at me, and for the first time his face changed. The corners of his mouth turned up slightly. His eyes crinkled. He was smiling. It was a primitive, shy smile, but it was undeniable. I realized then that everything I had been told was a lie. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't an animal. He was a cousin, a distant, forgotten relative of humanity who had chosen the woods while we chose the cities. He had emotions, he had humor, he had compassion. "Thank you," I whispered, tears freezing on my cheeks. He reached out and tapped his own chest, then pointed at me. "You, me, one." We sat there in silence as the storm raged outside, Two fugitives from two different worlds bound by a secret that could shatter civilization. But peace never lasts. As the wind died down, a new sound cut through the morning air. Not the whine of a drone this time. The heavy, thumping beat of rotors. Big ones. Blackhawks. I crawled to the cave mouth. Far below, coming up the valley we had just traversed, were 3 helicopters. They were following our heat trail. They were following the radiation of heat he gave off. I looked at him. He knew. The fear was back in his eyes. "They aren't going to stop," I said, loading a fresh magazine into my rifle. "They want you, dead or alive." He stood up, his full height nearly brushing the cave roof. He let out a roar, a sound of defiance that shook the snow off the trees outside. He wasn't going to run anymore. I knew in that moment that we were heading towards a violent end. If you want to see how 2 beings stand against an entire army, hit that subscribe button right now. You do not want to miss the end of this tape. There is a sound that anyone who has been in a war zone knows intimately. It's the sound of the cavalry coming. Only this time, the cavalry was coming to kill us. The 3 Blackhawks didn't land. The terrain was too steep. They hovered in a triangle formation, their rotors chopping the air into violent pressure waves that threatened to collapse our lungs. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was being blasted sideways, a white hurricane blinding everything. "Get back!" I screamed over the roar, pushing the guest deeper into the rock fissure. But he wouldn't move. He stood at the mouth of the cave, chest heaving, teeth bared. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was angry, a primal, ancient rage radiating off him like heat waves. I saw the ropes drop, thick black lines uncoiling from the bellies of the birds. Then came the men. They slid down with practiced efficiency, fast roping. These weren't your standard infantry grunts. They were the cleanup crew. The erasers, black armor, full-face ballistic helmets, weapons that looked like they came from a sci-fi movie. I counted 12 of them hitting the ridge. They fanned out instantly, moving in a pincer maneuver. I checked my rifle. 3 rounds left in the magazine, 1 spare clip in my pocket, 8 bullets against an army. "We don't have the ammo for a firefight," I yelled at him. "We need to cause a distraction, an avalanche, something." He looked at me. He understood the tone, if not the words. He looked at the soldiers, then at the massive boulder perched precariously above the cave entrance, a piece of granite the size of a sedan. He didn't hesitate. He lunged up the rock face, digging his claws into the stone, defying gravity. "Contact front." I heard a voice crackle over a loudspeaker. "Target is active, weapons free, I repeat, weapons free." The air exploded. The sharp crack, crack, crack of suppressed carbines tore through the wind. Stone chips sprayed my face. I raised my Remington, found a black helmet in my scope, and squeezed. The recoil punished my shoulder. The soldier dropped, clutching his leg. I wasn't shooting to kill, I still had that scrap of humanity left. But I was shooting to stop them. But they weren't focused on me. They were focused on the giant climbing the cliff. "Don't shoot him!" I screamed, a useless plea lost in the chaos. The guest reached the boulder. Bullets were sparking off the rock around him. I saw a puff of red mist erupt from his shoulder. He was hit. He roared, a sound that drowned out the helicopter engines and shoved the boulder. It groaned, tipped, and crashed down. It didn't hit the soldiers, but it smashed into the ridge they were standing on, shattering the ice shelf. The ground gave way. Tons of snow and rock cascaded down the mountain. 4 of the soldiers were swept away in a white blur, tumbling into the abyss below. The formation broke. Chaos ensued. "Now!" I grabbed his arm as he dropped back down. "Run!" We sprinted along the narrow spine of the ridge. The wind was howling, stinging my eyes. We were exposed, vulnerable. One of the Blackhawks banked hard, swinging its nose around. A side door slid open. A man was sitting there, not with a rifle, but with a large mounted device, a net cannon, or maybe something worse. "Incoming!" I tackled the guest, driving us both into a snowbank just as a massive weighted net fired. It missed us by inches, snapping against the rocks where we had been standing a second ago. We scrambled up, but we were surrounded. The remaining soldiers had regrouped. They weren't shooting bullets anymore, they were firing tranquilizer darts, long silver needles with bright orange flights. I took a hit in the thigh. It felt like a bee sting, then fire. My leg went numb instantly. I stumbled, falling face first into the snow. The world started to spin. The neurotoxin was fast. "No," I slurred, trying to crawl. "Get out." The guest stopped. He could have jumped the gap to the next peak. He could have disappeared into the whiteout. He had the power. But he turned back. He saw me lying there, paralyzed. He saw the soldiers advancing, tasers drawn, electric arcs crackling blue in the gray light. He made a choice. He placed himself between me and them. He stood to his full height, 8.5 feet of defiant nature. He opened his arms wide, shielding my body with his own. He didn't attack. He protected. Thwip, thwip, thwip. I heard the darts hit him. 1, 2, 6, 10. He flinched with each impact, but he didn't fall. He growled, swaying like a tree in a hurricane. He was fighting the chemistry with pure will. He swiped at a soldier who got too close, sending the man flying 20 feet through the air like a rag doll. But there were too many of them. The lead helicopter hovered directly overhead, the downdraft crushing us. A cable lowered. A man in a suit, the same man from my porch, leaned out. He was holding a rifle, not a tranquilizer, a real one. He aimed at me. The guest saw it. With a final heartbreaking act of strength, he turned and covered my body completely, curling over me like a protective shell. Bang! I felt the impact shudder through his body. He went rigid. Then, all the tension left him. He collapsed on top of me, his massive weight pinning me to the frozen ground. The world went dark. The last thing I felt was the rough texture of his fur against my cheek and the slowing beat of his giant heart against my chest. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the darkness. "I'm so sorry." Then the boots were all around us, voices shouting codes, hands grabbing me, dragging me out from under him. I tried to fight, but my body was stone. I saw them dragging him. He was limp. A net was thrown over him, a hook attached to the helicopter cable. They hoisted him up into the sky, a dark shape against the gray clouds, swinging lifelessly as the machine carried him away. A boot pressed down on my face, pushing me into the snow. "Secure the witness," a voice said. "Sanitize the site. Nothing happened here." And then everything faded to black. I didn't wake up in a cell. I didn't wake up in a hospital bed with straps on my wrists. I woke up in the driver's seat of my '88 Ford, parked on the shoulder of Highway 101, 20 miles south of my cabin. The engine was cold. My gas tank was full. The radio was playing a local news station. My head felt like it had been split open with an axe. That metallic taste of neurotoxin was still coating my tongue, mixed with the bile of fear. I checked my body. My clothes were clean, dry. The hole in my thigh where the dart had hit me, gone. There was a small pink scar, like an old mosquito bite. For a terrifying minute, I thought I had lost my mind. I thought maybe the PTSD had finally won, and I had hallucinated the whole thing. The blood, the snow, the guest. Then I looked at the passenger seat. My rifle was there, but the bolt was missing, and the scope had been smashed, the glass spiderwebbed as if someone had stomped on it with a heavy boot. A warning. I drove back to the cabin. I drove like a madman, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. When I pulled up the driveway, my heart sank. The cabin was standing, but it wasn't my home anymore. The door was unlocked. I walked in. It smelled of bleach. Not the faint smell of cleaning supplies, but an industrial chemical stench that burned my eyes. The floorboards where the guest had bled, sanded down and restained. The rug where he slept, gone. My pantry, emptied of the massive amounts of rice and beans. They hadn't just taken him, they had erased him. I ran to the woodshed, empty. Not a single hair, not a drop of blood. I grabbed a shovel and hiked up to the ridge. My bad knee, the one I had twisted in the chase, was perfectly fine. They had fixed me up while I was out. They patched me up so I couldn't claim injury. When I reached the cliff face, the site of the battle, I fell to my knees and wept. The boulder was gone. The crater where the avalanche started had been filled in with fresh earth and covered with straw and fast-growing moss spray. The trees that had been snapped by the helicopter fire, cut down and removed, the stumps ground into dust. It was perfect. It was a masterpiece of sanitization. If I hadn't lived it, I wouldn't have believed a battle was fought here 48 hours ago. I sat there in the mud, feeling the crushing weight of the government's power. They control the narrative, they control reality. To them, I'm just a crazy old vet who got lost in the woods for a few days. If I talk, they'll show my medical records. They'll call me senile. But then I saw it, glinting in the dirt, half buried under a fern where the cleanup crew hadn't looked closely enough. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a piece of gear. It was the stone. The smooth, round river rock he had slid across the floor to me in the shed. I picked it up. It was cold, but it felt alive in my hand. I turned it over. On the bottom, there was a scratch. A mark. It looked like a crude drawing of a mountain and a stick figure standing next to it. He had marked it. He knew. I wasn't crazy. It happened. He was real. He had a soul. He had fear. And he had saved my life. And now, he was somewhere in a concrete deep freeze being poked and prodded by men who saw him only as a biological asset. I stood up. The despair vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They made a mistake. They let me live. They thought that by cleaning the crime scene they could clean my memory. They forgot who I am. I'm a tracker. I'm a hunter. And now, I have a new target. I walked back down the mountain, gripping that stone so hard my knuckles turned white. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to hide. I'm going to find where they took him. This video is my insurance policy. Once I upload this, the clock starts ticking for me. I know they monitor the traffic. I know they'll be coming back, and this time there won't be any tranquilizers. But I don't care. I look at the woods now and they feel empty. The magic is gone. The mystery has been bagged, tagged, and flown away in a black helicopter. But the truth is harder to kill. They want you to believe the world is small. They want you to believe that everything has been discovered, mapped, and categorized. They want you to stay in your cities, looking at your screens, safe and ignorant. Don't let them. There are things in the dark that have more humanity than the people who run our world. I met one. I called him a friend. My name is Silas. I am a veteran of the United States Army, and I am telling you, Bigfoot is real. The government has him, and I'm going to get him back.